Well, it feels like we're back to visiting an old friend. We've been away from her for a while, but before we get in, let me give you a quick update. You should have got the text this morning. Gloria actually got called towards the end of service, and they took Amy to the hospital. Amy, she fractured her hip and her femur, and so they are basically saying that they need to take the leg. And so, but the problem is with the leukemia, her platelet counts aren't great for clotting and all that other stuff too. So there's some, pray for wisdom, pray for direction. I don't know. I know, this has been a long journey. This has been in the discussion for some time as far as, what to do, when to do it. The one doctor has been saying for a while they need to take the leg off, but the other doctor has been saying, no, you do that. She doesn't have the leukemia, would then not allow her to heal, wouldn't allow her to fight infection and all those things. So, but pray for Chris. I guess this morning or this afternoon, as we were getting towards the noon hour, her pain was just unbearable and she could not move her leg. That's how they found out that she had broken that. So, well, I don't know what to do here as far as giving a good review without spending a long time doing a review. But we are back in Esther. We last left Esther in Esther 5 on August the 6th. So let's do a little bit of a search and rescue mission and try to get our brains back there as we get into Esther chapter 6 tonight. We're studying this pretty dramatic history. Primarily, the focus is on a Jewish queen who is an Assyrian queen. So she's not really a Jewish, not necessarily a queen as in of the Jews, but being Jewish and as a queen in Assyria. We're at least right around 500 years before Christ. Esther is an orphan. Mordecai is her uncle, most likely, and so adopted father. There was a close bond. They lived in the Persian Empire. Remember that during this time period, Jews have assimilated by this point, and they picked up a lot of bad habits of the Assyrians, and that could be everything from leaving God out to just foods or whatever. But through God's hand of providence, Esther gets chosen in I always hate calling it a beauty pageant because it was so much more, and so much more grotesque, actually. But she ends up as queen. Her identity has been held back at this point from most people. They're not discussing her Jewishness. And then Haman, however, we're all used to saying Haman, I think, growing up, but probably Haman would be more accurate in that trying to get closer. We meet this guy who is bloodthirsty. He's a monster. He's set out this plan to annihilate the Jews, most likely because of what? What was Haman's problem? Pride is his big problem. Mordecai wouldn't bow down. What's his heritage? He's from a certain group of people. I can't hear you. Amalekite, yeah. That would work. He's an Agagite. And so Agagite, yes, that sounds like you're throwing something up instead of saying a word. So he has this plot to annihilate the Jews. And this is pretty much simply because Mordecai refuses to bow down is what sparks it. In Esther chapter 4, Mordecai challenges it is good for us to try to do that. So she begins to carry out this plan, and that's when we find Haman sulking at home, hatching this devilish plan to hang Mordecai. His wife Zeresh calls his friends together. It seems to be a Persian plight or a Syrian plight. You got to call somebody. You can't just make a decision. You got to call. Xerxes did that all the way through. He very rarely made any kind of decisions on his own without that input. And so it seems that even Haman gets the input of his wife and his. I see him running around because I don't have the microphone's not working, which means our online people struggle. That's because we have no battery. It's dead. I think that's probably what Dave went to get. I got a big mouth. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about people online. In here, we're okay. They construct a plan to make these gallows 50 cubits high, about 75 feet. Remember we said that was probably just like a hyperbolic kind of statement. I mean, it could be, but that would have been way above and beyond anything that is built structurally in that area during that time. So he is planning to go into the king and suggest that Mordecai be hanged on it, and then go off to his second banquet. Another prominent theme throughout the book is banquets, feastings. That's happening all over the time, and we're not done with the banquets yet. We're in between the banquets is where we're at right now. We're in between banquets 1 and 2 of Esther. Remember when we left Esther the last time, we left her where she called this together, and Haman is there, and the king is there, and she says, let's do another one. And the suspense is building at this point. The stress of the moment is building. So Proverbs chapter 14, verse 19 says, evil men will bow down in the presence of the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. And that's what we're about to see as we get into Esther chapter 6. The tempo kind of quickens here. We're at a banquet, and all of a sudden you get into chapter 6, and it's like ding, 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 ding. All this stuff starts, information starts flooding our minds as we get through there. To the casual observer, all these twists and turns and plots could be considered coincidence. There's a lot of people who comment on the book of Esther and say that it's most likely a farce because there's too much coincidence in their mind. Well, coincidence is a great way to explain God away. If you have a sovereign God, then it's not coincidence. If it's just coincidence, you can kind of move your mind away from God. But really, all of these quote-unquote coincidences reveal a very, very clear providential hand of God. Haman's world is going to begin to unravel. Frederick Buechner is an author, and he said that coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. I kind of thought that was interesting in light of the fact that the book of Esther, God is anonymous. His name is not mentioned, though he's not unseen, not unheard, but the name is not there. So God is taking a very active but a very low-profile role, even in this chapter. If there's any doubts about the comic nature of the book of Esther, just read this chapter. Because there's a lot of comedy that's going to flow out of this. It's funny and it's not so funny all at the same time as we get in here. The plot is constructed on a series of coincidences, on a series of misunderstandings, and then a huge reversal as far as Haman is concerned towards the end. Novelist Dorothy Sayers wrote about God's sovereignty and man's free will, and her insights in this chapter specifically. Thank you. I'm going to give you those. Do it that way. Okay. Sorry, I bumped the button. Here we go. From a storyteller's perspective, you understand that characters and events within a narrative, they have to drive the plot, but they have to do so in accordance with their nature. You know, it's kind of, if you're a good writer, you don't all of a sudden have this weird characteristic trait jump out of nowhere when it's not been part of their history up to this point. And so that would be true of this section. You know, for example, a timid person doesn't all of a sudden become bold. A character shouldn't be rescued from death by some unknown uncles 3 times removed that really has nothing to do with the story all of a sudden. Happens sometimes, but oftentimes those things ruin the veracity of the author of the story. It undermines the overall integrity. And I think that's really interesting as we get into this chapter, is because these quote-unquote coincidences, they argue that the plausibility of the king not being able to sleep on this particular night, his decision to listen to the chronicles of the king, and the happenstance of Mordecai's loyalty being read and his service going unrewarded, and Haman happening into the court, all this is just nonsense. Well, the reality is all of those things are in keeping with the characters that have already been introduced all the way throughout the story. So the integrity of it, whether or not that you want to call it a coincidence or sovereignty, is irrelevant, because the integrity is wrapped up within the story. Every person in this part acts according with his own nature. I want you to think about that when we read the text here in just a second, because you're seeing it come back out. When you read what the king is doing, it's pretty consistent with what he does. When you read how Haman is interacting and talking and plotting and planning, it's pretty consistent with the way we've seen him up to this point. We know that Xerxes is selfish. Shall we call him a hedonist? He's very much all about pleasure, all about his own desires. He wanted to be like everybody else and have these great exploits. And remember, he's kind of a lesser of the empire, really standing on the shoulders of others along the way. But he seems can't make a decision on his own. He does have a reputation for rewarding generously people when they did good things, when they honored him, when they did things that he liked, they got things. Haman, of course, pride, ambition, lust for power, lust for authority, consumed by hatred, energized by hatred in some way. If you think about Haman's actions, it's like you think about where their motivations are coming from, and that's where it's coming from. It's come from this hatred that gives him the motivation. So we've got all these tensions being built up. We get the hand of God really showing itself as we work into this section. This chapter is really it's a classic example of irony, thus the title of our message tonight, because there's irony all over the place in this particular chapter. And so some commentators call it the most ironic and comedic scene in the entire Bible. And you know, as it unfolds, it is pretty funny because of how it all works itself out. There's everything that you'd need in a good modern movie. There's vivid imagery. There's a high contrast between a couple of characters. There's this conflict. There's these surprises that pop out of nowhere. But the irony is not just irony for the sake of irony. It's irony for the sake of purpose. And so as we get through this, it's going to be quite fun to work about this. sometimes maybe you've seen the saying or the poster, "Today is the first day of the rest of your life." Yeah, I think Haman's feeling that about this point. But if anybody had said to Haman as he left home early in the morning and hurried to the palace that they would have been wrong, because really it was the last day of his life as this unfolds. Couple passages just to set us up as we get into there. Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 11, "As I live, says the Lord, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked will turn from his way and live." And if you watch this narrative carefully, you see God's long-sufferingness, even with Haman, to change his mind, to change his plan, to change his way. 2 Peter chapter 3, of course, verse 9, "The Lord is long-suffering toward us, where he's not willing that any should perish, but all should come to repentance." Remember in Matthew chapter 23, where we read, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent. How often have I wanted to gather your children as a hen gathers her chicks under their wings." But what's the last part of that passage? But they're not willing. You're not willing. And there's where the sovereignty of God and the free will of man kind of coexist in that moment. So on the basis of the verses we just read, it's safe to conclude that God's desire is not that sinners would die and not that sinners would perish. And even Haman in this situation, it's not that he would end up in trouble, but that he would change his mind through all of this. But as we know, and it's hard. You read a character like Haman, and you just kind of don't like him. And it's like, nobody would say it out loud, but you're like, I really don't care if he perishes, because that sounds really bad for us Christians to say things like that. It's okay if he falls off a cliff and ends up, in the pit somewhere. But we can't say that because honestly, God is still being long-suffering even towards us today. And I'm thankful for God's long-sufferingness. I really am. For the sake of those around me, for the sake of family and friends. But, if God had cut off the long-suffering, before my salvation, where would I be? And so very, very grateful. So let's dig into Esther chapter 6. And we're going to break it up into sections as we read through. So we're going to start at the beginning. During that night, so this is after the audience with Xerxes and Haman and Esther, after that banquet, after Haman is gone and had this big grand plan with Zeresh and his buddies, that night the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of the records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" Then the king's servants who attended to him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So we get into this, and I threw a few pictures up here just to remind you we're talking about a huge empire, an amazing, immense empire. So you've got, we're over here in Egypt, bordering on China, all the way up into Greece, this whole area. And of course, we are in the Winter Palace area in these particular scenes. Here's another map, the same thing, but that kind of helps you see how some of the things were broken down and the boundaries. Found a couple of reliefs of what the Susan Palace might have looked like. And I mean, if anything, these people knew how to build stuff, and it was gorgeous and laid with gold, and the tile work and the mosaic pieces, and And we're still finding stuff from the Assyrian empires. We're still finding new reliefs along the way. This actually is believed to be from the Susan Palace. This is in the Louvre, and it's the top part, just the top part of one of the columns that would have held the roof up. So below all of this would have been more stonework, and this would have been way up in the air, and there's the roof work coming across. Just amazing how these things have persisted even to our day. So we've talked a lot about the palace, and I said I was going to try to find something that would help us understand it. I'm not 100% certain this is 100% accurate, but it seems to be pretty close. So when we break all of this out here is the Great Gate coming into the complex. There would be gardens, there would be a lot going on. And so there is a court. There are 3 different courts: the military court, the second court. One of these would have probably have been the Queen's Court or area, and then this area here is where all the big stuff would have happened. This is where the king would have gone when it was time for the big ceremonial things. And this is a huge arena, a huge area. And then the Western Gate out on this side, and then back in here would have been bedrooms and housing of all of the different people. So, I mean, to get the ideals, we start talking about all these different halls and how people are moving. It's not, coincidence kind of goes out the window when you start talking about a palace complex this big and people being at a certain gate and coming through a certain thing at a certain time. So it's really kind of interesting as we pull this through. So we find out that Xerxes can't sleep. And so he listens to an attendant, and I just didn't call it Sleepless in Assyria the whole night, but I did put it up there. It is not a coincidence that the king's sleep, it forsook him, it fled from him, it abandoned him, it left him. You get the idea, even in the language that is within this, is that sleep was taken away from him. It wasn't just that, he had a bad piece of beef or something and couldn't sleep. The sleep was robbed of him. And the Masoretic texts, and even some of the others, don't have this nuance, but the Aramaic and Old Greek and the Septuagint really explicitly attribute any time where sleep is taken, it's a God action. It's God doing something. So even in the language here, though God's name, it doesn't say God took sleep from Ahasuerus. It doesn't say that, but even in the language, it would be within there. It seems like a lot of coincidences, and we have to think about things. Sometimes God wakes us up for a reason. And somebody asked me this morning, is the reason you couldn't sleep last night was because you were going to talk about Ahasuerus as not being able to sleep tonight. And I'm like, I don't think so, but I don't think that. But in this case, I think it's safe to say the Lord kept Xerxes awake so that he can protect Mordecai. That's the pathway we're going to see. As we continue on, we see the Lord has the king's servants read just the right chronicle so the king could find out what Mordecai had saved him from this plot. And Shakespeare said, "Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown." And you can imagine running this kind of complex, this kind of things, even though he was, big man on campus. I would have trouble sleeping a lot of nights. But they had all these things available to them. They had medications, not what we would call medications, oils and incense type things that would help them to sleep. They had musicians that would play specific melodies that would help people sleep. I don't know. It doesn't tell us the whole thing before he got to the reading part. I don't know if he went and had a little bit of corned beef and came back and laid down again, or I don't know what he did. Did he get a snack? We don't know. But at this point, we see this beginning to unfold, and our mind goes back a little bit maybe to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats a little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. When you got a lot, you got a lot more to worry about. It's when you're in charge of a lot. I don't know. I don't have all my kids out of the house yet, but some people say once your kids are out of the house, you'll sleep better. I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe you sleep less because you don't know what's going on with all your kids scattered all over the place. Right now, I'm banning all my kids from calling me because every time one of my kids call me, we inherit another dog. I think we're done now. Everybody that could have a dog has a dog, so we're done. Long story. Long story. We don't really know. Was it the cares estate? Was he worried about his finances? Did he eat too much at the Queen's feast? Did he have bellyache? I think, we could say all of these possibilities. Maybe he was puzzled at the Queen's request. I think it's clearer to see God. Well, Dr. Wearsby helped us out a little bit. He says God wanted the king to stay awake because he had something to tell him, and I think that's a real clean summary of what's going on. Wearsby goes on with this illustration. While visiting the zoo, I became fascinated with the nocturnal exhibit. Here were animals that most of us never see because they sleep in the daytime and do their living at night. While you are resting, said one of the posters, nature is busily at work helping keep the balance of life stable. And I thought to myself, Wearsby says, while I'm asleep, my Heavenly Father is busily at work making sure the new day will just be what He wants it to be. God's compassions never fail, but they are new every morning because God never sleeps, because God never stops working all things according to His purpose. And so we're seeing that unfold here. Now, when you read the book of Chronicles, please do not read 1st and 2nd Chronicles into this story. That's not what this is. I mean, it's easy to do that. These would have been a linear record of everything that's happened. Actually, if you recite it literally, it's in the book of remembrances of the deeds of the days. Our translations put records in Chronicles, but it's the day-to-day records of everything that has happened. It could be the same book that was mentioned back in chapter 2. In verse 23, we get a different title. In Ezra chapter 5, Ezra refers to the archives in Babylon. He uses that way. So they are what happened during the king's reign, and there would have been not just one king's reign, but several kings' reigns would have been available. But usually every king was consumed with his own story and not the stories of the fathers who had gone before him. They're official, they're historical, they're filled with facts, filled with details, names, locations, and you can quickly see why this could be something that might put you to sleep. It's just a history book. It's just facts. It's just details. It's interesting that we have some of Persia's records. Not these, but we do have some. Archaeologists have not found this original Persian annals that are mentioned here, and I don't think they ever will. But we do have quite a bit of them. Again, Ezra chapter 6 talks about the meticulous record keeping. In 520 BC, there was an original document signed by Cyrus that was written in 538. We have these. We can see these. They're available. So the background of all of that is available to us. And one commentator says sometimes sleeplessness comes with a purpose. Psalm 127 verse 2 tells us, "In vain you rise up early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat, for he grants sleep to those he loves. So I guess God doesn't love me very much because I didn't sleep last night. Is that the way this works? Just kidding. I don't believe that at all. But if you process it, there are few things in life that are so important as a good night's sleep. If you don't get a good night's sleep, you don't think as clearly, you try to do things and you're talking to your wife and you're like, yeah, Did you hear what I said? Yeah. That's the correct answer always when your wife asks, did you hear me? And I tried to process this way as I was trying to think of, go back to some times where you were sleepless, you were restless, and maybe you could sense that God was trying to get your attention. God had something for you to pray about, something he had pressed on your mind. Sometimes it's I wake up, I have for years kept notebooks and things by the bed because God wakes me up in the middle of the night, whatever I've been studying, and I wake up and I have another thought to add, and I jot it down and go back to sleep an hour or two later. But that's just my pattern. Sometimes God does have missions for us to accomplish. Go back to Matthew chapter 2 in your mind for a second. The wise men, these magi, left Bethlehem. And we read, now when they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said to Joseph, get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother while it was still night, and he left for Egypt. So there's God waking Joseph up in this to get him moving along. Sometimes it's a burden to pray about. Luke 2, we run into Anna, and one of the things that we read about her is she never left the temple, serving night and day with fasting and prayer. She's praying day and night. I've met a few of those late night prayer warriors, and you always want to get your requests in with those folks, by the way. Those are the ones, I don't know. I know we all have equal access to God, but sometimes you run into these folks and it's like, yeah, let me get my request in with you because it seems like you're going to rattle God's chain a little better than I can. Luke chapter 6, Jesus says the same. It was about this time he went off the mountain and prayed. He spent the whole night in prayer to God. And when he came back, he called his disciples to him and chose them and named them apostles. So Jesus stayed awake all night and prayed. So God can direct in those type things. So we see this Chronicles getting read. Yes, it was facts. Yes, it was details. Yes, I would assume either he's wanting his ego stroked, probably true, or he's looking for some boredom to lull himself off to sleep, probably also true. But it appears that neither are going to happen because of what gets read. One author says, can God direct in the books that people pick up and read? And I think the answer to that's pretty obvious. Yeah, he can. God can use anything. God does use many things in our life. I ran across this illustration. Late in February 1916, a British student bought a book at a used bookstall in a railway station. He looked at the book and rejected it at least a dozen times before, but that day he purchased it. It was Fantastes by George MacDonald, and reading that book eventually led to this young man's conversion. Who was he? Well, you know him as C.S. Lewis, a well-known, author and apologist along the way. And he wrote to a friend that he had picked up the book by hazard. That was what he had wrote in a note. I picked up the book by hazard. But again, God had given a choice. And God can direct us on what to read. There was a young man in North Africa, sought peace. First, he sought it in sensual pleasure. Then he went after philosophy and found himself more miserable. One day he heard a neighbor child playing a game saying, take it and read, take it and read. And the young man immediately picked up the scriptures and happened to open to Romans chapter 13, verses 13 and 14. And those verses brought him to faith in Christ. And we know that young man as Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo. And so, he's been the author of many numerous classics along the way. When you look at these things, you don't want to miss, and I want you to, I was trying to figure out the best way to help you understand the chronicle thing. This probably wasn't the first time that the servant has read these chronicles. So they're reading through the chronicles, and wherever they left off is where they pick back up the next time they started reading again. And this is where it left. This is where the bookmark was. This story about Mordecai is the exact spot in those chronicles where it was left off. And so in my mind, that I look at that and I see God's sovereignty even ahead of time, orchestrating when to stop and start these various sections of these chronicles, so that right now, in this moment, when Xerxes can't sleep, this begins to unfold. So we get into verse 2, and we say that it was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, and they sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Now, please do not think laying hands on Ahasuerus is the same way we lay hands on people to pray over them. This particular lay hands on them is malicious intent. This is a murderous plot. This is a plan to kill the king. And so you're listening to these chronicles, and I don't know, my mind, I sanctified imagination gets away with me sometimes, but I kind of picture Ahasuerus laying there and they're reading fact. And then there's this guy Mordecai that saved the life of the, what? Wait a second, can you read that again? Did you say that right? Because it's like, wait a second, now it's jumping out, something that he's known about. Obviously, he was there, but this has happened. And it's interesting that we're talking about this on the very morning that Haman is plotting to kill Mordecai. So Haman's plotting to kill Mordecai, but Mordecai was the one saving the king from being killed. And you say, well, who are these two people? That's a great question. When we get to heaven, you can talk to some people and let me know. Because we know nothing about Bigthana and Teresh. There's not a lot of information that we have. There's some suppositions, but I think the safest thing to do is leave it lay right there. So at this point, you feel the irony building, the sleeplessness, the reading, and now this unusual statement. And so when this statement is read, the king says, what honor or dignity has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this? Now remember, this is part of Assyrian culture. When somebody does something nice, you throw a banquet for them. When somebody does something nice, you send them the most expensive wines. You send them a certificate they can own part of the kingdom and manage part of the kingdom. You do things because that was the way you kept people liking you. People did something nice, you did something nicer for them. And so, according to Herodotus, of course, a historian, it was normal for Persian kings to honor somebody immediately. So as soon as it happened, there should have been a reward. So if you go back, for example, there was a man that saved Xerxes' brother, and Xerxes' brother, they immediately rewarded him and made him governor over Sicilia. I mean, it was like immediately. It was okay. You rescued, you saved the life, here you go, you're now the governor. And I love how they can just throw that out. They were mostly just titles for the sake of titles. I mean, you still weren't in charge of much. The king was still in charge, but it kind of sounds nice if you can say, well, I'm the governor of Sicilia. It just makes you sound good. So it's kind of surprising that king asks the question, and then perhaps even more astonishing, that the king's servant, in the end of verse 3, the king's servant who attended him said nothing's been done for him. Now, what are some possibilities here? What do you think happened? Why doesn't the king know this? I want us to try to think about this for just a second before we get going too much further. Jack?
I think they were maybe just trying to protect the king. If something happened, it's better just keep it under the rug.
maybe it's not such a good idea that the king knows that somebody's trying to kill him. What other possibilities? God's timing, of course, is part of this. One of the things I wondered was the king just getting reports and there were so many things going on? Is this not the first time he's had somebody try to take him out? You know, it's like, oh, somebody else is after me, so okay. And just kind of passed over it in that way. For whatever reason, he seems completely unaware. Again, that would be pretty weird for the king not to know at all that somebody had tried to kill him. But, you know, who knows? Now, the king mentions the word honor. What honor? And he says, what honor and what dignity? The two Hebrew words, one is yachar and the other is gedula. I like that word. That's fun to say, gedula. It is honor and advancement. That might be a little better way of understanding it. This dignity would have been an advancement. It would have been a moving forward in some way. Mordecai had received neither, and Haman had received both already. Haman has already been honored. Haman has already received advancement. And then later in verse 6, the king will mention, when he's talking to Haman, he'll only mention the word honor. Since Haman had already received this advancement and he hears only about honor, of which he never has enough, he kind of mistakes himself for the person who's going to receive the next thing later as we unfold this. I wanted to just stop and think about honoring for just a second. Again, we've talked about plenty of places. I could show you various places in history. Go back to Darius. You could go back to Silas-Solon. There's all these different historic examples of when somebody was honored. Greek culture did the same thing. Benefactors were taken care of. And even later, some Jewish writings draw on the combination of honor and advancement. This theme kind of sneaks in. There is a delay, and this is a key matter for Mordecai. Evidently this is some time has gone past, and we don't know specifically. Some people said it was 5 years before. You could get there. I could see that with the chronology of events. But the question has to come out is, did some junior clerk make a mistake here? Did the office memo get dropped, because it was put in stone and well, that's hard work to carve something back out? Did something happen? Again, the question that is begged, is God in charge of schedules? Is God in charge of our schedules and God in charge of times? Well, let's think about this for a second. Genesis chapter 40. After befriending Pharaoh's butler, Joseph thought it would lead to him being released from prison, but Joseph had to wait 2 more years after that until God had chosen him to become what would be the second ruler in all of Egypt. God had a specific day selected for the Jews to leave Egypt. Even the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, when the fullness of time came. In the midst of a confused and troubled and chaotic world, I think it's important for our mind to go back to Psalm 31, that my days are in your hands. My days, my time are in your hand. And this is something that I share a lot with people who are facing chronic illness or perhaps even something more life-threatening. It's a truth that is not comforting in the moment, but in the quietness of the night as it seeps in, I think it's good. Y'all ain't going to check out not one moment before God says so. You are here until God says so. And so doctors can say what they want, and you can think what you want, but your schedule is in the hands of a God who loves and cares and has orchestrating all things out for his good for our good and his glory. And we have to get it through our thick skulls that sometimes when God is delaying, it doesn't mean that God's denying. I think that's a Wiersbe quote, if I remember right. God's delays are not God's denials. And we get impatient and wonder why the wicked are prospering. I mean, think about this. Mordecai saved the king's life. And look at the position he's in right now. At this point, he's not in a good place. He is still a servant. He has been passed over. He is being picked on by Haman. He's being ridiculed. And again, going back to that idea of God being long-suffering, we sometimes really get impatient when the wicked are prospering. That's a real big theme in social media right now with some of the things going on politically, is like, how long is this stuff going to keep going on? How long is it going to be for somebody does something? How long? I'm hearing this in different things. They show, well, we found out this report, and we found out this recording, and we found this email. It's like, well, how much more of these do we have to find before somebody says something, before somebody does something? God's never in a hurry. He's just never in a hurry. His days are not like ours. His time is not like ours. And at the end of the day, you and I should be very grateful that God is long-suffering towards the nation of America, because we deserve to be snapped out a long time ago. Really, I mean, it goes all the way back, but really since World War II, we have been on a slippery slope culturally towards unrighteousness. And I say all that, and I still say she's still the best ship afloat, though. I mean, I'm not anti-America when I say that. I'm very much grateful to be American, but you see how God is being patient with us. And so it's important for us to, when God is being patient with you, you like it. When God's being patient with somebody you don't like, you want him to hurry it up. That's just the way our brains think, We're glad God doesn't zap us, right away. But our neighbor that keeps letting his dog do what his business in our yard every day and never cleans it up, you're like, God, you can make that dog get sick any day now. We do those kind of things, and it's just we're always in a hurry when it's affecting us, but when it applies to us, we want patience. And I'm just glad that I don't have to worry about either one of those, because God is dealing with both sides according to his plan. I'm reminded in the New Testament where it says the rain falls on the just and the unjust. You got one farmer saying we need rain. You got one farmer saying we need less rain in different settings around the country. But God is orchestrating all of those things out. Well, we get into verse 4. So the king said, "Who's in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the court, coincidence, outer court of the king's palace. He's on that outside edge, in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows, which he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What's to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king desire to honor more than me?" Such a brilliant man. Verse 7, then Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, let him bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to the one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus it shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor.'" Great story. Great story, Mara.
Wouldn't you have asked, well, what did he do for you? Or what did that person do for you? He's so full of himself that he's thinking
Oh, sure.
He saved his life, but it could have been somebody that did something less, and they have less honor. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, honor is often in degrees, certain things. Saving somebody's life and, swatting the fly off the dinner is two different kind of things. But there's a lot of things. I mean, it's interesting when Esther I hate jumping ahead in the story, but my mind goes to what Esther says, when the king finally says, who is this person? She says, it's this vile Haman, this wicked, horrible man. He calls him by what he is. And all we do is see, as we're watching this unfold, this guy's just a creep. He's a jerk. He's full of himself. He's arrogant. He's self-seeking. He is murderous. He is willing to do literally anything to get ahead. And so it's kind of weird. So we see this discussion falling out, and Haman has aspirations, and he is there early in the morning because he has a plan in mind. Now, he is there. The New Living Testament says, as it happened, and just as the hour was very early. It's a little bit of an extrapolation, but it's a good thought. It is early. It is the king asking, who's in the court. He's looking for some official. The king is trying to find out who's available, because the king's all excited now. Because A, he forgot to do something that's well known, and B, it's kind of a good thing to keep the good people on your side. So it's both all the way. Some of the questions that ran through my mind, does the king hear somebody come in? Did he hear Haman in the outer court and say, who's out there? Maybe. Or is he just simply inquiring to see who's available? Who's available for me to give my work to do? It's interesting that he doesn't seek advice from his servants, nor do they offer it. This servant that's read, you read just matter of fact, what's been done? Nothing has been done. So the scribe or whatever the feller's role was that was reading all these things didn't say, well, king, you should take care of this. I mean, this guy and offered advice. But again, the king can't do anything without somebody else. So he's going to get advice here in this particular situation. So Haman is in this outer court, and he gets to come into the inner court. The timeline is kind of vague, but it's early. It appears that Haman came in at some point during the night. One commentator says there were two men not sleeping that night. One with vile purpose and one with divine purpose. Haman was not sleeping because all he could think about is getting over to the king as quickly as could to make sure Mordecai gets hung on these gallows that he's had built. And on the other side, God's got Xerxes awake because he has something that he wants him to do. It's again the wickedness of Haman. He is so eager that he cannot wait to get to the king. He's already got a scheduled appointment with the king later in the day. There's another banquet coming up, but he can't wait for that. He can't wait for that audience. He's literally seething. He's I guess the old adage of seeing red at this point. That's all he can see. He's just seeing red. And he is coming to gain royal approval to hang Mordecai on this stake, on this gallows. He obviously thinks that it's kind of a, I can't remember the legal term. It's kind of a pro forma. It's just a matter of getting this out there. This is already going to happen. This is not something we're really discussing. I'm just going to say, this is what I want to do, and the king's going to stamp it. It's kind of that idea. He's more informing the king what he's going to do than he is asking the king if he can do it. That's the idea of what's going on here. I was reading a couple commentators that if Haman was up all night, one commentator says that Haman was grievously watching the gallows being built during the night. So he's had this conversation with Zeresh and his servants and family and they've got this plan to build these gallows. Well, we're banquet 1, banquet 2. We're during the night, the gallows are getting built. And so maybe he was supervising and making sure, he was measuring everything, making sure it was stout, and we don't want this thing to fall apart. And so I guess you could go from Haman's point of view, the earlier the hanging, the better, in his perspective. That way, Mordecai's body would be on exhibit all day, and Haman would delight in it. Remember, we talked about that with the gallows. One of the reasons you put somebody on a gallows was for public disgrace. It was not just about the death. That was true, but it's the same thing. Cursed is the man who hangs on a tree when we get into the crucifixion. Part of the crucifixion, yes, crucifixions were the most horrendous and perhaps the most calculated forms of death, probably even in history. But part of the process is there were roads that would be lined with people on crosses at varying forms of decay, just rotting away. Why? To humiliate them, to humiliate their families, to create an atmosphere of fear. And maybe Haman is thinking, I need to get Mordecai hung so I can enjoy my banquet later. Jack?
When you start thinking, if he's building these things at night, we all know how sound travels at night. These things are pretty big and they're going to be pretty stout. Don't you think somebody would be wondering what is being built over there or what's happening, even though it's across town or something?
The only supposition that I was able to, I asked the same question, so good job, Jack. Great minds think alike, right? The only thing I can think of is Assyria was under a constant state of construction, embellishment, adding on, growth, and so it's a good possibility that people are just used to the noises of the night. Don't know that for sure, but that's kind of where my mind went. I tried to find, same thing. I'm like, well, surely didn't Zeresh come out and say, hey, Haman, let's go to bed. You're keeping me up out here with the gallows. Or didn't the neighbors say, hey, what are you doing over there? Knock it off. Something. But it's probably, I think, culturally, when you look, when you guys have time, look up some of the Assyrian architecture online, and there are some gorgeous and beautiful things. We have more remnants of Persepolis, the main palace, farther over in the east than we do of the Susan Palace, but it would have been the similar as far as all the beauty and the grandeur, and they were the gardens. Persepolis had like these tiered gardens, much like the Hanging Gardens, but very similar in that. So I think that's probably, it was just so much construction going on. But I asked the next question. What would have happened if Haman had showed up a couple hours later? What would have happened? Well, the king would have had to consult with somebody else. That'd be the first thing that would be obvious, because if Haman's not there, he's going to find somebody. And Haman would have been left out of the celebration for Mordecai. God wanted Haman to end up spending the day honoring Mordecai when he was spending the night planning on killing him. God, if you will, is actually warning Haman that he'd better change his course or he's going to end up in trouble. Even this is a mercy. Again, no coincidence with God. This guy who's planning to kill a certain guy walks into the king, and the king says, hey, this guy needs to be taken care of and honored. And somewhere in this, you're not catching on that something's not quite right here. He can't catch it. He's so full of himself. And so you review all of these evidences of providence, and we can just be grateful to God. Psalm chapter 33, verses 10 and 11. The Lord brings counsel of the nations to nothing. He makes the plans of peoples of no effect. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generations. You know, people got plans. God's got the master plan. God's got the master agenda. And Proverbs chapter 21, verse 30, there's no wisdom, no insight, no plan that concede against the Lord's. There's not any scheme that's going to go up against God's plan. And then, of course, Romans chapter 8, we're reminded, if God be for us, who can be against us? We are safe in the plans of God. So Haman is standing in the right place. I think he's very maliciously there. And the comedic misunderstandings begin at this point. For those of us who know the rest of the story, we're going, yep. Let's see how this works for you, buddy. Because we know the rest of the story. Each man has something on his mind. The king has something on his mind. Haman has something on his mind. We know the character of both of those. We know that we can't know their thoughts other than this. We get to enjoy the comedy of errors as each character misunderstands the other one's intentions here. As you would expect, the king speaks first, and it turns out that Haman never gets a chance to say what he had come to say. As this plays out, we don't get the record of what Haman's speech was going to be. The king doesn't specify which man, and of course Haman, as has been well said, he's the egomaniac, and we just roll right into his arrogance. And let's just stop here as we look at this at verse 6 again. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "Now what's to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman says to himself, "Who else? Of course he's talking about me. I mean, come on, look at me. Look how good I am. Look how good looking I am. Look how tall I am. Look at my beard. Look at where I'm at in the country right now. I'm up at. There's nobody else out there that the king needs to honor. You know, it's just me, little old me, that God needs." And the king does not give any clue who he's wanting to honor. And like Mara said earlier, wouldn't you think, okay, let's get some more information before I make too many assumptions. Let's not, even if I think it's me, can we get some clarification here? Can we get a little bit more details before I stick my foot all the way down my throat? Karen. As we get into, very much so, as we get into this, when we get down into the rest of this, as this plays out, what Haman suggests seems to indicate that he is actually aspiring for the throne itself. He's second in command. Most people believe he's like this number 2, but that's not enough. He wants the throne. In fact, even later when he's grabbing Esther, what does the king say? Are you even going to assault my wife? You're going to take my wife too? You're trying to take my kingdom, now you're trying to take my wife? Yeah, Gary.
I was just thinking along the same line. He did just get invited, and the only one invited to Queen Esther's banquet. He was the only one, so why wouldn't he just think, oh my goodness, this has to be me. I'm the one.
Go big or go home.
I'm the man.
I guess so.
Go big or go home.
I mean, it's comedic because we know how everything else is, but it's also so tragically sad that he's so full of himself that his question is, who else but me? Who else but me? I mean, he's so full of himself, he can't even see that there's anybody else that's good, that might be deserving of any kind of honor. Mara.
I would have been afraid to wake the king up. He was sleeping. Here he comes in late at night to go wake up the king to ask him.
I think he was just hovering in the outside thing, just kind of going,
But that shows God's hand.
Oh.
Because, he could have
the timeline of all of this, everything from the fact that he couldn't sleep to the fact that Haman's there at the early hours. I mean, all of this timeline. I struggle, and I know that we look at this from a theological viewpoint, but I struggle how somebody could say, oh, this is just a bunch of coincidences. What? How do you have that many coincidences? I mean, one here or there maybe, but you've got a stack of coincidences that are adding up to sovereignty, and you're just going to keep calling them coincidences because you're more comfortable with it. But we'll leave Haman here for this week, because I really want to spend some time. There is a lot to unpack in verses 7 to 9. Everything that's going on. Some of the Hebrew is kind of difficult, and will help us understand some things. It was refreshing as I was looking back and kind of pulling this all back together. Some of that and looking at that. My Hebrew's not good. I have to get a lexicon to help me get through Hebrew stuff. So getting it out and looking at the words and looking at what all is, the next part, we've got Haman's arrogance, and the next thing is Haman's answer from his arrogance is the next point. And each detail of that is so revealing of just how we already know he's full of himself. Let's just show how full of himself you are. And so that's what we're going to do in verses 7 to 9. So don't read too far ahead. I watched a Superbook episode on this. You guys know what Superbook is? Superbook's a cartoon. And it's Bible stories. They go back in time, and these modern day kids end up in Bible days, and this girl meets Esther, and she's having trouble standing up for herself, standing up for the right with her friends back in modern days. And Esther, of course, stands up for her people, and she learns. And so, but be careful. I'm resisting. There are things that I want to go back and watch a couple movies that have been out. There's one from the 60s that's on this. It's probably more accurate than anything new. Back then, they weren't quite as intentional at destroying all these stories. So, but yeah, keep all this fresh in your mind, and let it encourage you. Evil men have evil plans, but God is still in charge. And I hate when evil befalls any of us. I hate it. I hate the pain and the agony. But if you want to deal with that, you're going to have to go back to the Garden of Eden and stamp on the serpent back there, because all that flows right out of there. But all the evilness that is out there in the world, just be encouraged that God's plan, his timeline, and what he is orchestrating, if you look at this from a master plan perspective and you start looking at this as God moving all these pieces around, such intricate timelines, not sleeping early in the morning in the outer palace, this section of the Chronicles being read, and you're looking at all this stuff, and if God is doing that in this story, how much is he doing in your story and my story? To continue to work out something, again, that is for our good and his glory. Father, I pray that you would help us to trust your timeline a little better. We struggle. We struggle with pride. We want what we want now. We ask that you would forgive us for those times that we are trying to push your plan. Help us to rest in you. Help us to seek you. Help us to discern and to study your word and to spend time in prayer and have godly counsel in our life, so that we can understand all of these various ways and means that you are doing. We are finite beings, and we cannot comprehend your ways. And God, I kind of like that, because I want a God that I can't explain away. and knowing that you are so much bigger and so much greater and have so much more going on, that I can trust you. You have been faithful in the past. You have been faithful today, and you will be faithful into the future. You are God. You do not change. And so we can trust you. God, I pray that in each of our stories, we may not have a Haman coming after us, but we may have things going on in our lives that people that are not seeking our benefit, or maybe something medical feels very harmful. Father, help us to do our best to trust you. Just again, there are so many folks that are going through stuff. I think of Amy. I really hate that she had to go through this. I don't like it. I wish that there were another way. But we have to step back and say that you're doing something here, and who knows what you're up to. Maybe this is the pathway that you're going to give direction and guidance and wisdom that might bring about her having better health and the healing that we've been praying for. We don't know what your plans are, and it's scary for Gloria and Steve and Chris, because the obvious part of the plan also, when we're dealing with illnesses that the medical science considers terminal, it's scary. And we don't know that that is your plan. But Father, help us to learn to trust you in the moment. Learn to be grateful for the next breath. Help us to not worry so much about all the stuff that's in the future, but help us to trust the God who is already there. And whatever that is, it's tough. Especially, I think of Shirley, and I think of Dawn and others who are facing cancer things and so many different ones, starting treatments and surgeries. And from a human perspective, God, we don't like it. We hate it. We don't like people that we love and we care. We don't like to see them go through this stuff. And I think we can be comfortable in telling you that. Help us to believe that you're big enough to handle our doubts, our concerns, our questions. But help us, God, to also, in our doubts, in our concerns, even in our worry, to find the peace that passes all understanding. To find the joy that is unspeakable and full of glory. To find the hope to see you walking on the water in the midst of the storm. Thank you for your word that shows us over and over again how bad situations and situations that were even deadly, you were working everything out according to a plan. And man would rise up against you, and you would extend mercy often. Justice also flew. And as we read all these stories, God, help us to not just think of them as just stories, but help us to think of them as a clear way to understand your character, your heart, how you act and interact with us in our day-to-day lives. May we find comfort, strength, and encouragement from that. Again, we are thankful that you do not change, that you are the same yesterday, today, and forever. And our hope rests in you. And to that end, we place ourselves in your care, knowing that what you are doing is the right thing. And help us to learn to walk through that and figure out what you are trying to teach us, what you're trying to tell us, and how you're trying to glorify yourself through it. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Good week, everybody. I'm short on bail money, so nobody get arrested. Oh, I guess I should.